In 1962, a Texas chicken farmer with a heart condition built a car that made Ferrari's lawyers send threatening letters. Not because he stole anything, because he beat them badly. With an engine they said couldn't work. Carroll Shelby had a problem. Actually, he had several. His racing career was over. Doctors told him his heart could give out any day, and he had this crazy idea that American muscle could embarrass European sports cars on their own turf. Everyone told him he was wrong. He wasn't. The story of the 427 Cobra isn't just about horsepower. It's about a man who understood something the Europeans didn't. Sometimes brute force is its own kind of elegance. Sometimes the solution isn't more sophistication, it's more cubic inches. Let's back up. By the late 1950s, American cars had a reputation problem. Sure, they were powerful. A Chevrolet could smoke most things in a straight line. But the moment the road curved, European cars made American muscle look like shopping carts with V8s. Jaguar, Ferrari, Aston Martin. These were the names that mattered in sports car racing. They had finesse. They had handling. They had decades of racing heritage. What they didn't have was Carol Shelby's particular brand of insanity. Shelby had been a successful racing driver. Won Le Mans in 1959 driving an Aston Martin, but his heart condition meant he couldn't race anymore. Most people would have retired. Shelby decided to build cars instead. His first idea was simple. Take a lightweight British sports car, stuff an American V8 into it, and see what happens. The British AC Ace was his victim. It weighed about 1,800 pounds. It had elegant lines. It had independent suspension that actually worked. What it didn't have was power. Shelby fixed that. The first Cobras used Ford's 289 cubic inch V8, small block, around 270 horsepower in street form, more with the right tuning. These cars were fast. They won races. They scared people. But Shelby wasn't satisfied. See, there's a philosophy in racing. Europeans believed in balance. Lightweight, perfect handling, just enough power. The engine serves the chassis. Shelby believed in something else entirely. He believed the chassis serves the engine, and if the chassis can't handle the engine, you build a stronger chassis. So in 1965, he did something that shouldn't have worked. He took Ford's 427 cubic inch big block V8, 7 liters of displacement, 425 horsepower in street trim, over 500 in race configuration, and he shoved it into a car designed for an engine half that size. The original AC Ace chassis couldn't handle it, obviously. The frame tubes were 4 inches in diameter. Shelby went to 6 inches. The suspension geometry needed a complete redesign. The transmission tunnel had to be widened. The wheel wells had to grow to fit wider tires. By the time they were done, the only things left from the original AC Ace were some vague styling cues and a general sense of British disappointment. The result was the Shelby Cobra 427, also known as the competition Cobra, also known as several unprintable names by Ferrari drivers who encountered it. Now, here's where we need to talk about what made this engine special. Because the 427 wasn't just a bigger version of the 289, it was a fundamentally different animal. The Ford FE big block family had been around since 1958. These were heavy iron engines designed for big sedans and trucks. Not exactly racing pedigree. But Ford had been developing the 427 specifically for NASCAR and drag racing. And when you spend years making an engine survive the Daytona 500, you end up with something remarkably robust. The bore was 4.23 inches. The stroke was 3.78. This made it slightly over square, which was good for high RPM operation. The block was cast iron. Heavy, yes, but almost impossible to break under normal abuse. The cylinder heads used a modified wedge chamber design that Ford called semi-hemispherical. Marketing speak, mostly. But the ports flowed well. The crankshaft was forged steel, cross-drilled for oiling. The connecting rods were equally beefy. Ford knew these engines would see sustained high RPM operation, and they built accordingly. In the Cobra, the 427 ran dual 4-barrel carburetors, Holley 780s typically. That's over 1,500 CFM of airflow. The intake manifold was an aluminum medium-rise unit designed for the RPM range the engine would actually use. Headers were custom fabricated for the tight engine bay, dumping into side-exit exhausts that announced your arrival from approximately 3 counties away. The compression ratio was factory rated at 11.1 to 1. In race trim, some builders pushed it higher, 12 to 1, even 12.5. This required aviation fuel or the best premium available, and even then, detonation was a constant concern. The margin between maximum power and engine destruction was measured in octane points. Peak power came around 6,000 RPM. Peak torque, somewhere north of 480 pound-feet, arrived much earlier, around 3,800 RPM. This meant the car had brutal acceleration from any speed. You didn't need to wind it out, you just stepped on it, and the rear tires would let you know they were overwhelmed. And this is where the Cobra became something special, not just fast, terrifying. The car weighed about 2,400 pounds with the big block. That's about 5 pounds per horsepower in street form. For context, a contemporary Ferrari 275 GTB had about 14 pounds per horsepower. A Jaguar E-Type was around 12. The Cobra was operating in a weight class by itself. 0 to 60 came in about 4.2 seconds. This was in 1965. The quarter mile took about 12 seconds flat, with trap speeds over 118 miles per hour. Top speed was somewhere north of 165, though frankly, the aerodynamics were so bad that the car became genuinely dangerous at those velocities. It had the brick-like profile of something designed in a wind tunnel by people who had never heard of wind tunnels. But here's the thing about the Cobra. It didn't need to be aerodynamic. It won races not by being efficient, but by being so overwhelmingly fast in acceleration that the aerodynamic disadvantage at high speed didn't matter. By the time competitors were catching up on the straights, the Cobra was already braking for the next corner. And the braking was another American innovation that Europeans hadn't expected. The 427 Cobra used massive Girling disc brakes at all 4 corners, not drums, discs. This was still unusual for American performance cars. The discs were over 11 inches in diameter with substantial calipers. The car could actually stop, which was fortunate given its acceleration capabilities. The suspension was independent at all 4 corners. This was critical. A live rear axle, which most American muscle cars used, would have been hopelessly outmatched by the power. The rear suspension used a double wishbone setup with coil-over shocks. The front was similar. With proper setup, the car actually handled remarkably well for something with its power-to-weight ratio. Shelby and his team spent considerable effort on chassis tuning. They understood that raw power meant nothing if you couldn't put it to the ground. The suspension geometry was set up for controlled oversteer. The car would rotate on throttle application, which in the hands of a skilled driver meant you could adjust your line mid-corner with the gas pedal. In the hands of an unskilled driver, it meant you could adjust your line mid-corner into a guardrail. This was not a forgiving car. The racing program proved the concept. In 1965, the Cobra won the FIA World Manufacturers' Championship in the GT class. This was significant. An American car, built by a small shop in California, beat the established European giants at their own game. Ferrari was not pleased. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. The competition between Shelby and Ferrari became personal. Enzo Ferrari famously called the Cobra primitive. Shelby responded by beating Ferrari cars on track. When Shelby proposed buying Ferrari's GT racing program, Enzo reportedly threw him out of the factory. The rivalry fueled both sides, pushing development at a pace that would have been impossible without someone to hate. The 427's dominance in GT racing came from a combination of factors. The engine's torque meant drivers could accelerate earlier out of corners than competitors. The brakes meant they could brake later going in, and the sheer straight-line speed meant any handling deficit was offset by velocity on the straights. But the engine's real secret was durability. Ford's FE block had been overbuilt from the start. Racers could run these engines at sustained high RPM for hours without catastrophic failure. The same couldn't always be said for the highly strung Italian competition. A Ferrari 12-cylinder was a thing of beauty and precision engineering. It was also prone to failure when pushed hard for extended periods. The Cobra just kept running. This durability came from the engine's origins. The FE family was designed for trucks and large sedans. It was built with huge safety margins. When racers asked for more power, there was plenty of structural capacity to spare. The main bearing caps were massive. The block decks were thick. The cylinder walls had material to spare for boring. You could extract significant additional performance without approaching the structural limits of the components. The 427 in particular benefited from Ford's NASCAR experience. Rules in stock car racing required engines to be based on production units, so Ford had incentive to build robust production engines that could then be modified for racing. The technology flowed both ways. Racing developments made it into production engines, and production engine durability made racing programs successful. By 1967, the original Cobra program was winding down. The FIA had changed rules to reduce engine size in GT racing, and Shelby's attention had shifted to the GT40 project and then to the Mustang-based GT350 and GT500. But the 427 Cobra had made its point. American engineering could compete with European technology, not by matching European sophistication, but by overwhelming it with power and durability. It was a different philosophy, and it worked. The production numbers tell part of the story. Only 348 street-legal 427 Cobras were built, ever. This wasn't mass production. This was hand-built machinery produced by a small team in California. Each car was slightly different. Weights varied. Engine outputs varied depending on the specific build. Some cars were delivered nearly race-ready. Others were set up for street use with lower compression and milder tuning. The price at the time was around $7,000, which sounds reasonable until you realize that a fully loaded Corvette cost about $4,000, and a Ferrari cost maybe double that. The Cobra was expensive, but buyers knew what they were getting. What they were getting was a car that could beat literally anything in a straight line and most things around a track. A car with no power steering, no power brakes in some configurations, no air conditioning, minimal weather protection, and a cockpit temperature that approached broiling on hot days thanks to the proximity of that massive engine. It was crude by European standards. The interior was basic. The fit and finish was acceptable at best. The gauges were sourced from wherever Shelby could get them. Nothing matched. Nothing was elegant. None of that mattered when you put your foot down. The driving experience was visceral in a way modern cars have almost entirely lost. The engine's vibration came through the thin firewall. The exhaust note was physical, felt as much as heard. The steering was heavy at low speeds and communicated every road imperfection at high speeds. The clutch required a strong leg. The shifter required deliberate effort. And the acceleration. The acceleration was addictive. Modern supercars are faster. They accelerate harder. They handle better. They're quieter and more comfortable and infinitely more refined. But they don't feel the same way. There's an electronic intermediation between driver and machine that the Cobra completely lacked. In a 427 Cobra, there was nothing between you and the engine except a throttle cable and about 5 inches of firewall. When you pressed the accelerator, things happened. immediately, violently. The car responded to inputs with a directness that modern vehicles, with their drive-by-wire throttles and electronic stability systems, simply cannot replicate. This made the car simultaneously more exciting and more dangerous. The mortality rate among Cobra owners in the 60s was not good. These were powerful, difficult cars sold to wealthy enthusiasts who often overestimated their driving ability. The combination was predictable and often fatal. Shelby himself was characteristically blunt about this. He knew the cars were dangerous. He built them anyway. His philosophy was that adults could make their own decisions about risk. If they wanted a car that could kill them, he would sell them one. This attitude would be impossible today, obviously. Regulatory requirements, liability concerns, and changing social expectations about automotive safety have made vehicles like the original Cobra impossible to produce. You cannot sell a new car in the United States without extensive crash testing, emissions compliance, and safety equipment. A car with the 427 Cobra's power-to-weight ratio would need electronic nannies to pass modern stability requirements, which is why the original cars are now worth millions. Current market values for authenticated 427 Cobras run between $1 and $3 million, depending on provenance and condition. Competition history adds value. Original documentation adds value. Being a low serial number adds value. The most valuable examples have sold for over $4 million at auction. This pricing reflects both rarity and cultural significance. The Cobra has become a symbol of a particular moment in American automotive history. It represents a time when a small company could challenge established European giants, when racing success could be achieved through ingenuity and determination rather than corporate budgets, when cars could be dangerous, and buyers accepted that as part of the appeal. The influence on subsequent American performance cars is difficult to overstate. The Cobra proved that American engineering philosophy focused on displacement and power rather than sophistication and efficiency, could succeed at the highest levels of international competition. This validated an approach that would continue through subsequent decades of American performance cars. The Corvette's development was influenced by the Cobra's success. The muscle car era of the late 60s was enabled in part by the Cobra demonstrating that big American engines could power genuine sports cars, not just straight-line dragsters. Even Ford's GT40 program, which ultimately took overall victories at Le Mans, built on lessons learned from the Cobra racing program. Carroll Shelby went on to become a legend. He continued building performance cars into his 80s. He put his name on Mustangs and Dodges and various other projects. He remained characteristically direct and occasionally profane until his death in 2012 at age 89. His heart, the one doctors said would kill him in his 30s, held out for another 5 decades. The 427 Cobra outlived its creator by remaining relevant. Continuation cars are still being built by companies with varying degrees of official connection to the original program. Kit cars based on the Cobra design are among the most popular in the world. The basic formula, lightweight chassis, plus big American V8, continues to appeal to enthusiasts who want directness over sophistication. The original cars, the 348 street examples, and the competition vehicles are now scattered in collections around the world. Some are driven occasionally. Most are preserved as investments and historical artifacts. A few continue to compete in vintage racing, where their combination of power and durability still makes them competitive against cars built decades later. There's something appropriate about that. The Cobra was never about being careful. It was about maximum effort, maximum power, maximum commitment. The cars that survive continue to embody that philosophy. The engineering lessons remain relevant. Sometimes the solution to a technical challenge isn't more complexity, it's more power. Sometimes the best approach isn't finesse, it's force. The 427 Cobra proved that elegance takes many forms, and sometimes the most elegant solution is simply overwhelming the problem. Carol Shelby understood this intuitively. The Europeans had their sophisticated multi-cam engines and their carefully tuned suspensions and their decades of racing heritage. Shelby had a 7-liter cast-iron V8 and a complete lack of interest in doing things the established way. He won. The engine that shouldn't have fit in a sports car, built by a man who shouldn't have survived to build it, became one of the most successful competition vehicles of its era. It beat Ferrari, it beat Jaguar, it beat the expectations of everyone who thought American engineering was too crude to compete at the highest levels. And it did it not despite being crude. It did it because the crude approach, properly executed, was actually better for the specific challenge at hand. That's the legacy of the 427 Cobra. Not that sophistication is wrong, not that European engineering was flawed, but that there's more than one way to solve a problem. And sometimes the Texas chicken farmer with the heart condition sees the solution that the established experts miss. So that's the 427 Cobra, an engine too big for its chassis, in a car too dangerous for its era, built by a man who refused to accept the limits everyone else assumed were fixed. Still can't believe doctors told him he had months to live in 1960. If you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week. Drop a comment if you've ever seen one of these in person or if you think I got something wrong. More coming soon.